The first terrifying moments. Elizabeth Smart's ordeal begins. It all started like any other humid summer night in Salt Lake City. A house full of laughter, the warm aroma of burnt potatoes gently lingering in the air, and the innocence of childhood stories shared between sisters before sleep. Yet, unknown to anyone, an unlatched kitchen window would shatter every sense of safety for Elizabeth Smart and for her whole family in an instant. Elizabeth had always gone through the usual nighttime rituals, her family's soft prayers, the sleepy routine of checking doors and windows with her father, and reading a fairy tale to her younger sister Mary Catherine, before letting exhaustion take over. She never imagined fear could creep quietly, silently, through the cracks of her home. The house was still and velvety dark when the nightmare began. An unfamiliar sound sliced the quiet, a subtle, metallic jolt, like someone careful not to wake the world. Elizabeth's eyes blinked open in the half-shadows. In that split second between dream and waking, confusion turned to paralyzing fear. There, at the edge of her bed, stood a man, his outline blurred and monstrous in the faint light. He pressed a cold blade to her throat, his voice a chilling whisper. "Don't make a sound, come with me." Her thoughts scattered like dry leaves. There was no time to scream, no chance to debate running or fighting. Every muscle in her body froze. Her mind tried to grasp reality, but panic pushed reason aside. She saw Mary beside her, unmoving, feigning sleep with the kind of terrified discipline only a child could muster. Those first moments stretched and stretched, as if time slowed out of some cruel courtesy, forcing Elizabeth to register every sensory detail. The scratchy bedsheets bunched around her legs caught on her skin as she sat up, trying not to tremble. She felt the metallic smell of the knife, the rough breath of the intruder on her neck, heard the minute scraping of his shoes on carpet. She wanted to scream for her father, mere feet away down the hallway, but the threat of violence sealed her voice deep inside. In her mind, a million questions and frantic plans spun. Was this a dream? Would her parents hear her? Could she grab Mary and run? But the knife pressed harder, the man's grip tightened, and hope seemed to twist in on itself until there was nothing left but obedience. When he tugged her from bed, Elizabeth moved as if sleepwalking, her senses both heightened and muffled by shock. Each step out of her bedroom was a betrayal of everything she once thought safe. She passed family photos glowing faintly on the walls, the once comforting furniture that now formed a gauntlet between her and any chance of rescue. Down the hallway, the pulse in her ears thundered, shame and fear mixing as she realized how slim the odds were of being seen or saved. In her bare feet, she was led out of the sanctuary of her childhood. Outside, the night was too quiet, her legs trembled with the chill of uncertainty. She caught flashes of moonlit lawn, the rough bark of a tree, and briefly the hand that dragged her, marked with dirt and hunger. The distant sounds of traffic, so ordinary most nights, now seemed mocking in their indifference. As her captor led her away, Elizabeth felt her consciousness shrink into a tight, hard knot. She followed the man not from trust, but from the knowledge that he wouldn't hesitate to end everything in seconds. Her final glance back at the house, hoping for a light or a figure to appear, etched itself into her memory. A desperate, silent wish that someone, anyone, would know she was gone. A shadow crosses the threshold. It was one of those strange, breathless hours after midnight when the house lay quiet and the world outside seemed so distant, so harmless. Elizabeth drifted in and out of dreams, the kind where everything is soft-edged and nothing bad can happen. But that sense of peace shattered when she heard it. The scrape of metal against glass, almost gentle, like someone hesitant at first, or knowing exactly what they were doing. At first, Elizabeth didn't move. She was used to ordinary household noises, the piping sigh of old plumbing, wind grazing the eaves, or her father's slow footsteps during his nightly rounds. But this was different. It was a sound so alien, so calculated, that her body tensed without thinking. She thought she heard the faintest jingle. The kitchen window, left slightly open, had betrayed her family. Before she fully registered what was happening, the dark outline of a figure blotted out the familiar blend of shadow and moonlight. A cold breeze swept into the room, carrying with it the warning sting of danger. The man who emerged from the darkness seemed enormous, his face hidden, but his presence overwhelming. He found his way through the living room, not stumbling or hesitating, as if he had rehearsed this intrusion in his mind 100 times. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. As she squinted into the shadows, she realized how vulnerable her family was. Even the state-of-the-art alarm hadn't sounded. She'd noticed earlier that it had stayed silent because a magnetic sensor had slipped. Now, that oversight felt like a cruel twist of fate. The floor creaked under the stranger's careful, slow weight. Every step was measured, deliberate, never breaking the spell of silence that pressed upon the house. Elizabeth could barely breathe. She turned her head a fraction, seeing her little sister lying close by, still as a stone, eyelids fluttering. Did Mary sense the looming terror, or was she mercifully asleep? Then, out of the numb hush, came the threat, the gleam of a knife in the intruder's grip catching the barest light from the hall, and the soft command, unmistakably male, deep but eerily calm. "Don't make a sound, get up and come with me." Elizabeth's body refused to obey her brain's frantic messages. Instead she watched herself, almost from above, as she propped herself up on trembling arms, sheets pooling around her legs. The man's hand closed around her arm, his grip iron-hard but eerily cold. For a split second she wondered if this was just the most vivid and terrible of nightmares. But the slice of fear in her chest was real. All the warmth of her bedroom, the mismatched knickknacks, the posters on the wall, the scent of clean laundry, vanished, replaced by the oppressive immediacy of survival. For a moment she hoped for a miracle, her father's face at the door, her mother's voice ringing out, but hope was crowded out by the cold certainty that no help was coming. Not now. The shadow, now her harsh reality, motioned her toward the open window. In the corner of her eye, familiar furniture became strange, like objects in a sinister dream. She was marched forward, barefoot, silent, her every instinct screaming to run or shout but paralyzed by the threat at her throat. Outside, the night felt endless, no longer a blanket of peace, but a gaping unknown carpeted with danger. Those minutes, maybe seconds, maybe hours, stretched into a lifetime of dread. Elizabeth never forgot the way her heart wanted to leap from her chest, the sticky press of fear crawling up her spine, or the empty mocking silence broken only by a predator's controlled breathing. She left behind her home, her safety, and her childhood in the wake of one shadow's crossing, and stepped, unwilling, into the darkness beyond. The familiar face has turned into a nightmare. He wasn't a nameless boogeyman hiding in the shadows. Elizabeth recognized the kidnapper's face even through the blur of terror and moonlight. That rough jawline beneath the hood, those startlingly familiar hands grabbing her wrist, both belonged impossibly to Emmanuel, the so-called handyman her father once hired to fix their roof. It was a realization so surreal, so cruel, it spun her fear into a brand new horror. The world she thought she knew had cracked wide open, and what crawled out looked her directly in the eyes. As Brian, his real name she would later learn was Brian David Mitchell, dragged Elizabeth out the back, the neighborhood vanished behind her like a theater curtain. They cut through the black tangle of bushes and backyard fences, past white garden stones and the family's old maple, and into the strip of wilderness she'd only ever seen from driveway safety. Emmanuel, Brian, now her captor in full, hardly said a word. The silence between them was the most frightening thing she'd ever heard, filled with invisible threats and the sharp sting of betrayal. Elizabeth's memories of that walk are a collage of details, woven together by cold sweat and mounting disbelief. The air, heavy with pine and distant city dust, scratched her lungs. Each hurried step through wet grass and broken twigs sounded too loud, as if the whole world could hear her being stolen and still do nothing. Her pajamas caught on thorny branches. Once she stumbled and felt him tighten his grip, yanking her up without breaking stride. Here was a man she should have been able to trust. He'd eaten with her family, exchanged polite small talk with her parents, so why was he leading her beneath a sky with no mercy? Every ordinary thing took on sharp, frightening new meaning. The bark of a distant dog became an accusation. Porch lights blinking out one by one were like silent witnesses turning their backs. Elizabeth's heartbeat thundered in her ears when she glanced back at her home, surrounded by the same neighborhood comfort, yet so impossibly out of reach now. It felt like the world as she knew it was dissolving with every step further from her own backyard. When the tree line broke and an unfamiliar encampment appeared in the dark, Elizabeth's panic peaked. There, standing by a makeshift tent and a flickering lantern, was a woman waiting. Wanda Barzee, Brian's wife, looked almost spectral in the moth-lit fog. She smiled, but not with kindness. Elizabeth realized there would be no help here, only more faces complicit in her nightmare. Inside, a hollow emptiness began to take shape, a sense that the safe, everyday universe had been replaced by something lawless and cruel. She had known this man, or thought she had, and now his face was the mask of her worst nightmare. His voice, once harmless, became the lock on her freedom. Even the trees seemed to lean in, holding their breath for what unspeakable things would happen next. Every sense told her to scream, run, fight. But the shock was paralyzing. She moved like a sleepwalker, every step away from her family an act of reluctant obedience under the weight of Brian's threats. Trust, once simple, now felt like a cruel joke. In those moments Elizabeth understood. Evil was not always a stranger, sometimes it wore the face you'd seen across your living room table. Every minute stretches into eternity. Every second seemed to blink by with the slow, torturous crawl of eternity. Time, which once dictated her school days, her family dinners, and the laughter shared over board games, now lost all meaning. Inside the crude forest camp, Elizabeth's understanding of hours and minutes evaporated, replaced by a grim routine of constant, paralyzing dread. At first she counted her breaths, clinging to each inhale as proof that she was still alive. The forest around her was a prison and a witness, branches reaching in like silent accomplices, moonlight tracing bars across damp undergrowth. The air inside the tent was thick with the musty odors of sweat, wet canvas, and fear. Every time Brian's boots scraped against the dirt or Wanda's voice broke the hush, Elizabeth's heart would seize, sure that some new order, some new threat was about to descend. The days bled together in a nightmare loop. Even when the sun filtered in through the leaves, she felt no warmth. Instead, the diffuse light just made her more aware of how exposed she really was. When night came, every crackling twig and animal sound stoked fresh dread. She was trussed to a tree by a length of cable that gnawed at her skin, unable to stand or even stretch without permission. Hunger pangs and thirst battered at her resolve, and the humiliating rituals of forced obedience stripped away every scrap of dignity. Brian's threats, always soft, always laced with that sickly calm certainty, echoed in her mind far louder than the birdsong or wind, or even her own racing thoughts. There were moments when, distantly, Elizabeth tried to imagine how her parents might be searching for her, or if her disappearance was all over the news. But hope felt dangerous, a tongue of fire that Brian would snuff out the moment she let it kindle. To keep herself together, she sometimes retreated inward, repeating silent prayers or recalling stories from childhood. Still, every small comfort was fleeting. One wrong move, one noise too loud, and Brian's chilling promises of violence against her and her family flooded in anew, and she fell into line, numbed by terror. When searchers' voices drifted through the trees, sometimes just yards from her makeshift prison, Elizabeth's body and mind froze like prey in the open. Every muscle screamed at her to shout or run, but the invisible chains of fear held tight. She became a ghost in daylight, obeying for survival, watching her own life from behind the wall of trauma. Minutes and hours lost all shape. Time in captivity was no longer a river flowing forward, it was an ocean, endless, crushing, nowhere to run and no rescue in sight. The family's panic. The moment Mary dared to run to her parents' bedroom, frantic and shaking in the blue light of early dawn, the Smart family's world split apart. For a long, disorienting instant, Ed and Lois Smart tried to ground themselves in the surreal reality. Their 9-year-old, usually so even-tempered and composed, was now gasping for breath, words stumbling over each other. Her terror was palpable, a living, pulsing thing. Ed blinked sleep away and instinctively pulled Mary into an embrace, hoping to soothe her out of what he first believed was a bad dream. Lois brushed Mary's hair back gently, whispering reassurances even as dread began to slither into her chest. "Honey, slow down, tell us again, what did you see?" But Mary's stubborn insistence, the trembling in her hands, and the haunted look in her usually bright eyes, these told them that this was no ordinary nightmare. Mary described in choked fragments the man's silhouette, the glinting knife, the whispered threats, the way Elizabeth had vanished out the door. As the final traces of sleep fell away, panic set in. This was happening, right here, in the safety of their own home. The parents leaped from bed, calling out their daughter's name into the unforgiving stillness. Each empty room, each silent corridor, became a sentence of dread. When they reached the kitchen and found the window screen slashed, the sickening truth landed. Their home, their haven, had been violated. Lois dropped to her knees, running her fingers along the torn mesh as if it could tell her where Elizabeth had gone. Ed's hands shook so badly he could hardly dial 911. Tears sprang to both their eyes as a cold weight settled over everything. How could this have happened? Every protective ritual, every prayer, every lock double-checked, every goodnight kiss, seemed suddenly frail and futile. Neighbors were woken by shouts and sirens, floodlights flickering to life across the block. word of the kidnapping swept through the community with the speed and shock of lightning, leaving behind a storm of fear. Volunteers arrived by the dozens, flashlights and walkie-talkies in hand, desperate to help comb the city's foothills and empty lots for signs of Elizabeth. But for Ed and Lois, every minute was a fresh torment, searching for hope in the crack between despair and denial. They fielded endless questions from detectives, trying to recount every detail of the night, racking their tired brains for anything, any single overlooked thing that might explain, that might bring her back. Guilt gnawed at them. Should the alarm have been set? Why was the window left unlatched? Did they overlook some warning? Those first hours blurred into one impossible stretch of panic, nausea, and grief. For the Smart family, the world became a swirling chaos of police radios, dog teams, news vans parked on the street, and the choking silence left by Elizabeth's empty bed. The desperate search. The first faint glow of sunrise on June 5th brought no relief, only an overwhelming sense of terror for the Smart family as they realized Elizabeth was truly gone. In the immediate aftermath of her disappearance, their home became a hub of frantic activity, echoing with voices and footsteps, but always haunted by a sense of disbelief. How could a young girl vanish without a sound from such a close, loving home? The police arrived swiftly. Soon, their tranquil Salt Lake City neighborhood was swallowed by sirens, flashlights, and anxious onlookers. Officers set up a makeshift command post in the Smart family's living room, while neighbors, still in pajamas, gathered on the sidewalk, desperate for any news or task to help. For Ed and Lois Smart, there was no time to process their own heartbreak, the well-being of their other 5 children. The weight of media scrutiny, and the ceaseless stream of questions from detectives left them ragged and sleepless. Flyers were printed overnight bearing Elizabeth's photograph, a school picture where she smiled shyly, her gaze sweet but almost naive. Hundreds of volunteers, led by church members and friends, canvassed the city on foot and in cars, stapling her photo to telephone poles, the walls of grocery stores, and even the seats of park benches. With every mile walked and every flyer given away, hope flickered and twisted, sustaining the community through their exhaustion. Helicopters hovered overhead for days, their searchlights combing the foothills and ravines east of the city. Search and rescue teams, dogs in tow, swept through brush, creek beds, and abandoned sheds. Divers scoured local ponds and irrigation ditches, driven by the morbid fear that any scrap of clothing or hair might be a clue. Each new discovery, a shoe here, a piece of cloth there, tightened everyone's nerves, but none belonged to Elizabeth. The investigation sprawled outward with every passing hour. Inside police headquarters, walls were soon lined with maps and photographs. Detectives constructed elaborate timelines, diagramming the Smarts' routines and interviewing every friend of the family, every contractor who had ever worked on the house, every neighbor within shouting distance. Tips poured in by the hundreds, alleged sightings, suspicious cars, vague rumors. Investigators followed them all, often driving for miles only to find that the girl seen in a supermarket or hiding behind a dumpster was not Elizabeth. For Ed and Lois, each lead was a surge of hope brutally dashed. They appeared repeatedly on television, their faces hollow with fatigue. They pleaded directly into cameras, begging for their daughter's safe return, their carefully chosen words nearly drowned in grief. The Salt Lake community opened its heart, meals were delivered, prayer circles formed, and strangers sent letters of encouragement from across the country. Yet each passing day without Elizabeth deepened the ache in the Smart home. Her siblings quietly rearranged their habits, slept huddled together, and whispered about the bad man in language both childish and unbearably real. Suspicion fell quickly on the people closest to the family. The police questioned Elizabeth's uncles and older cousins, even as the Smarts bristled at the suggestion of betrayal from within. Soon, suspicion turned outside to neighborhood workers, plumbers, gardeners, and a now notorious handyman known only as Emmanuel. Meanwhile, the media descended, trucks with satellite dishes trundling down the family's street, journalists asking intrusive questions, and television crews fixating their lenses on the most vulnerable moments of the family's nightmare. Despite feeling suffocated by this circus, Lois and Ed refused to retreat. Every day, they and their friends would organize new search parties, knocking door to door farther and farther from home. Volunteers gathered in the church gymnasium at dawn, clutching coffee cups and maps, determined to scour every inch of trail or vacant lot, no matter how bleak the prospect. Some carried walkie-talkies, tracking each other through the brush, calling Elizabeth's name again and again to the silent air. As the weeks dragged on and leads dwindled, These volunteers began to share stories of their own fears and nightmares, how their trust in the world had been shaken, how their own children now locked every window at night. Sometimes Ed would wander through these search parties, his voice hoarse but gentle, thanking everyone for their efforts, urging them not to lose hope. Lois, meanwhile, clung fiercely to her faith. She coordinated vigils, standing among neighbors holding candles in trembling hands, sending whispered prayers up into the dark mountain air. Yet doubt crept in everywhere. Had Elizabeth been taken far away? Was she even still alive? The investigation lurched through false starts and dead ends. Police briefly considered a convicted sex offender who lived nearby, then another handyman who had a minor criminal record. When one suspect, Richard Ricci, died in police custody, rumors flickered through the community. Had the truth died with him? But again, Elizabeth's trail vanished. The police and family forced to reckon with their own desperation as the investigation seemed to stall. Through the relentless summer heat and into the autumn, Elizabeth's absence became a raw, open wound in Salt Lake City. The Smarts' mailbox overflowed with letters, some kind, some cruel, and many from self-proclaimed psychics claiming visions or clues. Still, the family sorted through every scrap of information, never daring to dismiss even the most improbable leads. Friends delivered meals nobody had the appetite to eat. The youngest children drew pictures of Elizabeth playing, always with a sun and a smiling sky, as if to bargain her safely home through crayon hope. Holidays came and went, rituals observed by rote. Birthdays suddenly felt quieter, shadowed by an empty chair at the table and the underlying question, how does a family celebrate life when a part of its heart is missing? For Ed and Lois, the search became their entire existence. Their home filled with boxes of news clippings, stacks of maps, stacks of messages, and a silent hope that one day, the phone would ring with good news. But the larger search, the one for peace and answers, seemed endless. Counselors came and went, bringing both comfort and reminders of the impossible road ahead. The family clung to one another, sometimes speaking of Elizabeth in the present tense deliberately, sometimes unable to speak of her at all for fear of jinxing hope. Every sleepless night was another battle, another opportunity to imagine what more they could do, haunted by the sense that in some distant place, Elizabeth was waiting for them to find her before it was too late. Meanwhile, the city transformed. Lawn signs reading "Bring Elizabeth Home" appeared almost overnight. Yellow ribbons unfurled from trees, fences, and car antennas, visible reminders to keep searching, to keep believing. Entire blocks joined together to organize food drives and fundraisers, their spirits united in the grim camaraderie of shared loss. Yet even the strongest faith was tested daily by the relentless ticking of time and the steady stream of tips that led nowhere. For the Smarts, every knock at the door and every ring of the telephone delivered a jolt of terror mixed with hope. They waited for news from detectives scouring national databases and combing through endless tips, their house now both a sanctuary and a prison. At church they prayed for miracles and shared tentative updates, aware of the curious eyes of the congregation, who longed for closure almost as much as the family did. Months blurred together as newscasts marked the passing of time since Elizabeth's disappearance. 15 days, 30, 60, 100. Still the investigation marched forward, propelled by sheer will and love, but also haunted by the growing horror that justice, and even answers, might forever elude them. Their search was no longer just about finding Elizabeth. It became a symbol for every missing child, every parent's nightmare, every desperate hope too fierce to put into words. Through winter's cold and new spring rains, the Smarts and their supporters continued, driven by conviction that somewhere, somehow, Elizabeth was holding on, and so must they. The days of being imprisoned. From the terrifying moment she was taken, the world Elizabeth knew seemed to disintegrate. Her existence was ripped out of the familiar and forced into an unrecognizable, nightmarish reality. The days and nights that followed her abduction stretched endlessly, blurring into one another and growing increasingly surreal as she grappled to survive in captivity. In the damp makeshift camp tucked deep within the tangled woods, Elizabeth was stripped of every comfort, every trace of normalcy. Her captors, Brian David Mitchell and his wife Wanda Barzee, ruled the small patch of forest like tyrants. They forced her into a threadbare robe, performed a twisted marriage ceremony, and then bound her to a tree with a metal cable that cut into her skin with every movement. The pain was constant, a reminder that her freedom, both physical and mental, was suspended indefinitely. The air in the camp hung heavy with the scent of wet earth, rotting leaves, and the bitter tang of fear. Elizabeth quickly learned that silence and compliance were her only safeguards against Brian's unpredictable outbursts and Wanda's cold indifference. Any small rebellion, even a moment of hesitation, invited violence or cruel punishment. Hunger gnawed at her daily. Some days she was given scraps of garbage, spoiled food scavenged by Brian, and told to choke it down, her dignity eroded with each bitter bite. Water was rationed intentionally, turning every swallow into both a physical necessity and a twisted test of obedience. Elizabeth's body grew weary from malnourishment and exhaustion, but it was her mind that suffered the harshest blows. She was subjected to a relentless pattern of psychological torment. Brian's words were laced with prophecy and delusion. He painted himself as a messenger and her as a prisoner of divine purpose. His soft voice delivered the most chilling threats. He whispered that any attempt to escape would bring deadly consequences to not only her, but to her family far away. The forest seemed to conspire with her captors. Every time a chopper thundered overhead or the distant voices of search parties echoed faintly in the trees, Elizabeth's hopes surged and crashed within seconds. Brian would clutch her arm tighter, mutter warnings, and keep her hidden beneath filthy tarps or deep within foliage. The hopes of rescue, so close yet always out of reach, became a torment of their own. Wanda, for her part, shifted unpredictably between moments of stern silence and cold assistance to Brian's delusions. She brought Elizabeth cheap blankets and sometimes a morsel of better food, but always with a haunted detachment, as if she saw the teenager not as a person, but as someone to be managed, perhaps envied or pitied but never truly cared for. At night, when the branches scratched against the tarpaulin tent and the darkness thickened with secrets, Elizabeth retreated into herself. She hummed fragments of lullabies, prayed in whispers, and tried to remember ordinary days, dinner with her family, the texture of her favorite quilt, the sound of her brother's laughter through bedroom walls. Time itself lost all definition. Each sunrise brought not relief, but a new repetition of humiliation and despair. Sometimes Brian would disappear for hours or days, leaving her with Wanda, whose own moodiness made every hour unpredictable, or he would keep her close and endlessly repeat the rituals and rules that governed his version of captivity. He forced Elizabeth to drink alcohol laced with medications that dulled her senses. This left her feeling numb and foggy, like a ghost haunting her own body. Her only constants were the elements: sun that burned her skin through the thin robe, rain that seeped through the shelter's tears and left her shivering, the bite of cold carried on the wind at night. She shuddered through feverish chills, prayed for scraps of food, and flinched at every grinding footstep in the underbrush. Amid these hardships, even the smallest kindness, a glance away, a break from duties, a moment where bleak silence replaced threats, became a momentary reprieve, a flicker of her old self. Elizabeth lost track of the days. The forest, once a faraway backdrop to her childhood home, became her entire world, a world painted in grime, pain, and numb repetition. She sought anchor in memory whenever she could, picturing her parents' faces, the cadence of her mother's voice saying, "I love you," the memory of crackling autumn leaves on her street back in Salt Lake City. She clung furiously to these fragments, refusing to let Brian's warped reality rewrite her identity, even as the weeks melted together and hope became a dangerous luxury. Every fleeting chance at rescue became a test of resolve and terror. Once, when searchers passed so close that Elizabeth could hear them calling her name, she stayed frozen, silenced by Brian's menacing grip and his graphic threats. She realized, horrifyingly, that survival required obedience, at least for now. Her terror wasn't only for herself but for her family, whose safety Brian used as leverage for compliance. Rituals in captivity were equal parts absurd and excruciating. She was made to recite prayers and prophecies according to Brian's demands, forced to endure hours of his rambling revelations, and participate in daily tasks that twisted any sense of normal routine into a grim charade. The couple's vigil over her was constant. If she tried to sleep, she was sometimes jolted awake by Brian's voice or a new punishment for imagined disobedience. Despite the pain, the hunger, the humiliation, Elizabeth's inner world did not vanish. She imagined conversations with her siblings, rehearsed what she would say to her parents if she could somehow deliver a secret message, and, on the darkest nights, tried to convince herself she mattered beyond the boundaries of her prison. This quiet resistance, hidden from her captors, was her only act of defiance, the hopeful fuel for endurance. In a place defined by isolation, cruelty, and silence, it was the last thing Brian and Wanda could not steal. Paralyzed by fear, In those endless days and nights of captivity, terror seeped into every fiber of Elizabeth's being, freezing her mind and body in a kind of horrifying paralysis. The moments of acute fear were not simply flashes of panic, she lived in them, wore them like a second skin. Each day she awoke not to hope or the fresh possibility of escape, but to the heavy, suffocating dread that nothing had changed. Her kidnapping was not just a single traumatic event, but a constant state of psychological siege, each hour heavier than the last. Elizabeth soon discovered that fear could be worse than pain. Physical pain is a sharp, definite thing, something the body reacts to and often recovers from. But fear, especially the kind bred in captivity, is all-consuming and corrosive. It eats at confidence, identity, even the ability to think clearly. When Brian David Mitchell barked orders or whispered threats, when Wanda Barzey's watchful eyes followed her every move, Elizabeth felt frozen in place, as if the world had narrowed to a pinprick of terror. All her energy was consumed by the single imperative: survive. And to survive, she needed to never, ever provoke her captor's wrath. Each motion, each word was measured and cautious, dictated by a survival instinct that dominated every waking moment. She remembered how, at first, her mind reeled with plans of escape or rescue. She would listen for search parties, pray the helicopters overhead would spot her, try to remember details she might later relay to police. But as the days blurred together, fear smothered those thoughts. Brian's threats, that he would kill her or her family if she resisted, became internal laws she could not break. She could not allow herself to contemplate escape, not even in her most private thoughts, for fear that someone, somehow, would know. Her terror was so absolute it broke down even the boundaries of her own inner life, policing her mind as ruthlessly as her body was policed. Elizabeth's body learned the language of fear too. She moved gingerly, careful to avoid anything that might be interpreted as defiance, a glance, a sigh, a misstep. Her shoulders hunched in involuntary submission, her arms curled close to her chest as if she could shrink out of sight. Whenever Brian approached, menace hanging in the air, she would go entirely still, eyes downcast but mind racing. During the longest days she sometimes felt herself detach, watching her own actions from afar, as though the real Elizabeth was hiding somewhere deep, unreachable and untouched for a time when it would be safe to return. This dissociation was not the absence of feeling, but the only way to survive a world saturated in threat. Even in the rare moments of what might pass for calm, dread was never far behind. Each new day was a question mark. Would she be punished, starved, forced to endure more of Brian's ranting sermons? Would he decide on a whim to harm her or send Wanda to do so? The uncertainty bred its own anxiety. Without warning, she might hear his footsteps in the dirt or the zip of a tent flap, and all the old adrenaline would surge back, fight or flight, even though she could do neither. And with every fearful encounter survived, Elizabeth absorbed a little more of her captor's arbitrary power, a little less of the belief that she would ever see her family again. Communication with outsiders, even the faint hope for it, was paralyzed by terror. Once, she heard her name called by a search party somewhere in the forest, voices so achingly close she could have cried. But she stayed still as stone, Brian's hand gripping her arm, his warning hissing in her ear. The risk of endangering her family, the threat repeated until it became a drumbeat in her mind, overpowered every desperate urge to scream. Even after such moments passed, the self-loathing that followed threatened to crush her, layering guilt upon fear in a punishing spiral. Why hadn't she tried? Would she ever be brave enough? There were times when the fear physically manifested itself, hands trembling uncontrollably, breath rapid and shallow, stomach twisted into knots she thought would never loosen. Night was often the worst. The silence of the woods magnified every snap of a twig, every distant animal cry, turning them into harbingers of yet more suffering. Elizabeth would lie awake on the hard ground, afraid to sleep, afraid to move, simply existing in a half-conscious state of terror. Sometimes, she longed for unconsciousness, an escape from sensations and memory alike, but her mind refused to let go, locked in a perpetual state of vigilance. Over time, this paralytic fear bred its own strange routines. She began to anticipate her captor's demands before they spoke, striving to appease them in hopes of some peace. She memorized the small signals, Brian's change in tone, Wanda's mood swings, that warned of trouble. It was a survival strategy, but it came at a cost. Elizabeth felt herself fading, her personality, desires, and even her sense of humor locked away in some far-off room. She was no longer the confident, playful girl she'd been before, but a shadow moving through a series of silent negotiations with fate. The paradox of Elizabeth's fear was that even as it numbed and paralyzed her, it also kept her alive. She learned quickly that resistance, at least in the early days, meant pain and danger not just for herself, but in the sick logic of her captor, for those she loved most. Terrified of bringing harm to her family, she buried whatever rebellious sparks might have flared. Submission became her armor, numbness her only defense from a reality too cruel to process fully. Yet despite this emotional hibernation there remained a tiny pilot light inside her, something unbroken. In the loneliest moments she would recall her mother's voice or her father's hands, steady and reassuring beside her bed at night. Those memories flickered dimly behind the wall of terror, giving her just enough warmth to endure another day. Fear had forced Elizabeth into a coma of the soul, but it never managed to extinguish the sliver of self that would one day help her find her way home again. A rare opportunity passes by. Every survivor of a long captivity can recall fleeting moments when escape seemed possible, a kind of cruel hope that flickers and fades, haunting them long after freedom finally arrives. For Elizabeth Smart, those moments weren't just haunting, they were sharp, living wounds that cut deeper each time a chance at rescue slipped by. It didn't happen in dramatic spurts of action, like so many people might imagine from the movies. Instead, those near misses came quietly, catching her off guard in the humblest of places, a crowded library, a public party, on busy sidewalks where, astonishingly, nobody recognized the fear in her eyes. What made these opportunities so agonizing wasn't just their rarity, but the psychological web spun around her by her captors, Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. Their threats were not empty. Brian, with a calm but chilling voice, repeated over and over that if Elizabeth dared scream or try to flee, he would kill her or her family in the blink of an eye. Wanda enforced those rules with an icy watchfulness, always hovering nearby, ready to do her husband's bidding. Under those circumstances, every potential encounter with the world was colored by a suffocating terror. One of the most painful close calls happened right in the heart of Salt Lake City's main library. Brian had found ways to rationalize taking his family out in public in elaborate disguises. Elizabeth in a strange, heavy wig and a long veil, her features smothered beneath layers of fabric. The air outside was a shocking contrast to the musty, closed-in world of the camp, and just the echo of dozens of voices was enough to send tremors through her chest. Yet she walked beside her captors, moving stiffly, afraid any wrong look or nervous gesture would become an excuse for Brian to erupt and make terrible good on his threats. Inside the busy library, the trio's strange attire drew a few sideways glances, but nothing more. At the reference desk, a librarian paused at the sight of Elizabeth's shrouded face, the way she clung wordlessly to the adults with her. The woman behind the counter asked hesitantly, "Is she all right? Can I help you with something?" Brian smiled, introducing Elizabeth as his daughter, fabricating a story of deep religious conviction that required the girl to remain veiled in public. Elizabeth's heart pounded as the librarian's gaze lingered. She willed the woman to see past the disguise, to find something amiss in her eyes and voice. For one suspended breath it seemed possible, her own hand tightening around the library card, as if transmission of hope could pass through contact alone. But the moment passed. The librarian nodded, perhaps uncertain or unwilling to challenge a stranger's quirks, and turned away. Every second spent in the city's heart was a test of Elizabeth's resolve, a paradoxical agony. The world was so close, rescue within arm's reach, but everything inside her screamed to stay silent. She had been conditioned not only by threats but by the exhausting calculations of risk. Could she speak up without triggering violence? Could she trust that anyone would believe a veiled, fearful girl in the grasp of two adults who looked on the surface like religious zealots instead of criminals? Even the presence of police officers, those people she once saw as the embodiment of safety, brought no comfort. The fear that Brian might snap and hurt others was ever present. After the library there were other shattered hopes, times when her captors mingled with the public in ways that seemed impossible when she lay shivering in the camp at night. Sometimes they wandered busy city streets. On one surreal afternoon, Elizabeth was forced to accompany Brian and Wanda to a local church event. Surrounded by laughter and conversations about school, groceries, and neighborhood chores, she moved like a ghost. She could almost remember what it was like to feel safe within a crowd, but here, Brian's whispered threats coiled around her like invisible chains. He kept a punishing grip on her elbow at all times, reminding her with every squeeze and shadowed look that people's lives, her own, her family's, depended on her absolute silence. There was one moment at a crowded summer fair when a uniformed officer walked within feet of Elizabeth. For the briefest instant his gaze ping-ponged from her veiled features to Brian's grizzled face, then away again as he returned to checking IDs at the gate. Elizabeth's pulse thrashed against her throat, and for a second she thought of running, darting through the crowd and flinging her arms around the officer, forcing the truth into the open. But the memory of Brian's face, contorted and cold with promise of violence, was stronger than any childhood memory of police as protectors. Instead, she kept her eyes low, her lips pressed in a tight line, and she let the moment slip away. Someone else's voice cracked a joke. People laughed. The world kept moving, unknowing, while she floated on a raft of isolation disguised as obedience. These near misses became their own kind of torture, planting seeds of aching hope that were again and again extinguished. The terror wasn't just that she might be lost forever, it was that she might fail to act when salvation was close enough to taste. She replayed these moments in her mind at night, picking apart every decision she made. What if she had screamed in the library? What if she had caught the officer's attention? Could she have written a desperate plea in a book and left it behind? None of these scenarios led to a certain happy ending, and the stakes for failure were too high. The weight of Brian's threats, direct and implied, were relentless. He spoke often, and with great specificity about what would happen to her younger siblings should she disobey. He painted graphic scenes of violence that haunted Elizabeth well into her nightmares. For a 14-year-old girl, that burden was both paralyzing and enduring. She became, paradoxically, both prisoner and jailer, complicit in her own silence, surviving by betraying every instinct to scream for help. In one instance that still haunted her, Elizabeth remembered a trip to a bustling grocery store, the air crackling with the sounds of daily life, beeping scanners, crying babies, and the low drone of pop music on the speakers. A cashier squinted at her, thrown by the awkward dynamic between Brian and his daughter. Elizabeth's heart hammered wildly as the woman's eyes lingered, uncertainty resting on her lips. But before the pause could erupt into real suspicion, Brian interjected, praising his quiet, obedient girl and steering conversation away with practiced charm. Elizabeth shrank inward, her hope deflating as the employee turned her attention to bagging groceries. There were also times when the outside world nearly brushed up against her inner nightmare. Helicopters and search parties would sometimes be close enough that she could hear the crunch of boots in the underbrush or the sound of search dogs barking through the trees. Elizabeth would freeze as the sounds drifted toward their makeshift camp, her entire body becoming a tuning fork of anxiety and yearning. Brian and Wanda would hide her under filthy tarps or camouflage her among refuse, muttering warnings and grabbing her so tightly she thought her bones might snap. Each time the rescuers' voices became fainter and fainter, swallowed by the wilderness and the passage of time. Sometimes Elizabeth could hear them calling her name, a lifeline so close yet permanently out of reach. Despair became a steady companion. The psychological toll of these experiences was immense. Elizabeth lost track of how many times her heart had dared to flutter with hope, only to be beaten down by circumstance or by her captor's twisted ingenuity. She grew to distrust her own longing for freedom, learning instead to fall back on numbness, an emotional armor as essential as food or water. Her captors normalized abnormality, forging routines where silence and compliance were the only shields. Even when outside, even among people, Elizabeth felt encased in an invisible wall of dread, certain that any show of defiance would end in disaster for those she loved. What is perhaps most shocking to those who hear her story is not that Elizabeth failed to seize these rare chances, but that no one else could see what she silently screamed with every fiber of her being. Deep down, a part of her began to wonder if she would ever be noticed at all. If perhaps she had become so altered, so cautious, so diminished by fear, that the world no longer knew how to read her distress. The realization hurt almost as much as the missed opportunities themselves. She sometimes imagined what she would say if given the chance. "Help me! I'm Elizabeth Smart!" But the sound of Brian's voice always drowned out the fantasy, twisting hope into guilt and defeat. As months wore on, every new trip into town, every forced public encounter, carried both risk and a miserable, impossible temptation. She learned that freedom wasn't just about running, it was about timing, trust, and a support system ready to recognize a silent cry for help. The courage to act wasn't always enough on its own. The weight of trauma, the threat of violence, and the uncertainty of rescue combined to lock Elizabeth inside a cage that followed her everywhere, even in the sunshine and babble of crowds. When asked years later about these missed opportunities, Elizabeth never blamed herself. She came to understand painfully that survival sometimes means inaction, that the cost of courage in those moments might be paid not only by the captive, but by innocence caught in the web of someone else's evil. Each chance not taken was another day survived, a thread in the fabric of resilience that eventually would become her lifeline home. The family has suffered throughout the years of losing their child. Few experiences can compare to the all-encompassing grief and relentless ache that grip a family whose child has vanished into the void. For the Smarts, those long months and years of Elizabeth's absence were not marked merely by the passage of time, but by the daily struggle to survive an emotional storm that threatened to pull their entire world apart. Every sunrise brought not hope, but the cold slap of reality. Their daughter's bed was still empty, her laughter missing from the morning clatter, her place at the table only a hollow ache. In the beginning there was chaos. A hurricane of activity, visitors, well-wishers, detectives pacing the halls, volunteers streaming through the door with casseroles and comfort nobody could taste. The house that had once been a haven felt more like a glass aquarium, with neighbors, journalists, and police peering in, dissecting their grief, searching for clues not only to Elizabeth's whereabouts, but sometimes to assign blame. Ed Smart and his wife Lois moved through this circus in shock, clinging to lists and tasks as if order could somehow stave off the terror. They slept in shifts, answered every phone call, and searched Elizabeth's room for any sign, any message left behind. The silence in her drawers, her closet, her notebooks, was deafening. The effort to keep hope alive became both a family mission and a quiet torment. Each sibling was affected in their own way. Some lashed out in confusion, others grew silent, slipping away into private worlds where Elizabeth returned each night in dreams. Mary Catherine, who had witnessed her sister's abduction, awoke for months with screams caught in her throat, forever replaying the worst night of her life. Lois tried to hold the younger children together with soft words and familiar bedtime stories. But each story's warmth turned cold the moment the lights were switched off. Even the smallest changes in routine were loaded with meaning. Someone forgetting to set the table for Elizabeth would burst into tears. Her brothers would return from school, hesitating at the threshold as if expecting to find her waiting by the door. Holidays became rituals of denial. Christmas brought the agony of hanging up Elizabeth's stocking and wrapping presents she would not open. On her birthday, the family gathered around a cake that nobody wanted to eat, taking turns voicing wishes for her safety, careful not to name the fears that grew heavier with each month. Friends and relatives visited, trying to maintain normalcy and encourage faith, but everyone danced around the yawning gap in conversation and the impossible questions: how long before hope becomes delusion? How can you help a mother sleep when her daughter's slippers are still under the bed? Behind closed doors, guilt gnawed at Ed and Lois like a persistent rat. Had they failed to protect Elizabeth? Was their home truly safe? Had they missed signs, locked the wrong doors, placed too much trust in strangers? They replayed each detail of the weeks before the kidnapping, scrutinizing memories for errors in judgment invisible until it was too late. Ed was tormented by the thought that his decision to hire Emmanuel, later revealed as Brian David Mitchell, had opened the door to horror. Lois's motherly instincts warred with doubt. She tried to be strong for the younger children, but some nights sobbed until dawn, clutching Elizabeth's favorite sweater to her chest. Their marriage was both tested and deepened, for grief does not always unite. There were days when one clung to hope as the other was drowning, and both parents learned the slow, impossible work of holding each other through the darkest nights. Outside, the world continued to watch. The family's every move was scrutinized by media, and strangers left letters, some filled with empathy, others with callous suggestions or superstitious cruelty. More painful than the media glare were the plateaus of silence where the investigation seemed to stall, tips dried up, and the house shrank again into isolation. Lois would sit by the window long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at the city lights, whispering prayers to the empty night, bargaining with any power that might return Elizabeth to them. There were moments of hope, a seemingly credible tip, a new sketch, a psychic's insistent claim that Elizabeth was still alive. Each one lifted the family on a crest of wild, desperate hope, only to crash them down in exhaustion and deeper despair when nothing changed. Over time, life had to move forward, no matter how unnatural it felt. The younger Smarts still needed to be fed, schooled, held together. Ed returned to work in fragments, his mind always split between bills, worries, and a constant urge to dash out the door and join the search. Lois organized prayer circles and spoke to other parents in pain, finding strength in shared sorrow, but never forgetting her own private hell. The house filled with stacks of newspapers, notes from volunteers, and prayer cards. Elizabeth's possessions, piano books, trophies, trinkets became both shrine and torture, evidence of a life cut short that could not be set aside. At times, community brought comfort. Candle-lit vigils stretched out in the front yard, friends and strangers singing softly in the cool night, holding hands and hoping together. Neighbors brought meals, washed the family's laundry, sat in living rooms when Ed and Lois were too exhausted to move. Yet even with this support, there were moments when grief circled the family like a wolf, waiting for weakness. Ed, sleepless and raw, would sometimes find himself lost in the middle of the night, walking the blocks around his house, clinging to the memory of Elizabeth's laughter echoing down the sidewalk. Perhaps the most persistent suffering was in the not knowing, the endless parade of what-ifs, each scenario worse than the last. Elizabeth's absence was not a simple wound, but an infection carried throughout the body of the family, invisible to outsiders, and almost too terrible to describe. Lois often imagined opening the door and seeing her daughter's face, but those daydreams grew harder to hold on to as weeks stretched into months. The family was trapped in a world where closure, even tragic, would have been a cruel mercy. Uncertainty forced them to relive the moment of her disappearance every single day. Throughout it all, hope mutated. At first it was bright, fervent, and everywhere, banishing doubt, keeping the family's spirits alive through the endless interviews and fruitless searches. As time wore on, hope turned quieter, more private. It became a routine, a surface to keep afloat on, even while the waters of despair rose higher every week. Ed and Lois learned to mask their pain from their children, but each night, after everyone else was asleep, they confronted the simple, unbearable truth. They would do anything just to see Elizabeth alive or dead, just to know what had become of her. The months without Elizabeth forged a complicated resilience in each member of the Smart family, a resilience mixed with scars. They lost innocence, trust, and the sense that the world made sense, yet they clung to each other and to the belief that one day, against all odds, Elizabeth would come home. Her empty room, the drawings her siblings made with her always included, every yellow ribbon tied by strangers around the city, these things wove a tapestry of patience and pain, a daily assertion that one girl missing could unite both a family and a community in never-ending hope. Escape from the prison of the mind. In the narrative of Elizabeth Smart's ordeal, the day she was rescued stands as not only a turning point in a harrowing crime, but also the symbolic eruption of light after an era-long night. For many, it marked the triumphant end to a story of captivity. A child returned, 2 criminals encircled by justice. But for Elizabeth herself, liberation meant far more than mere physical release. It was a wrenching, delicate, and complex emergence from the inner psychological prison her captors had forged in her mind. The events of March 12, 2003 unfolded like a fever dream for Elizabeth. She'd spent 9 months moving between makeshift encampments, enduring routines crafted solely for her submission and silence. The streets of Sandy, Utah were raw with late winter wind when she finally returned to public view. For weeks, her captors had grown bolder, bringing her closer to civilization in the delusional belief that their divine protection rendered them invisible. On that day they walked together, Brian David Mitchell, Wanda Barzee, and Elizabeth herself, down a busy street, their strange attire instantly drawing attention. Elizabeth's face was veiled by a gray wig and layers of cloth. Her mind still whirred with warnings, don't make a sound, don't ask for help, or they'll make good on every calm, chilling threat they ever uttered. Even as her feet ached on the sidewalk and curious stares followed, fear pulled her back into the grip of habits born from months of captivity. To the outside world, Elizabeth must have seemed hesitant and dazed, her gestures contained, her gaze flickering with uncertainty. But nobody watching could know the magnitude of the psychological battle raging within her. Even at the moment of her possible salvation, she questioned whether escape truly meant freedom. Would she ever feel safe in her skin again, or would every shadow contain the threat of recapture? Would her family recognize her beneath the filth and the months of silence, or had she become a stranger, a ghost of the girl she'd once been? Everything changed in a single, sudden encounter. An observant couple recognized the trio from media coverage and alerted the police. Within minutes, officers encircled them in a grocery store parking lot. For Elizabeth, the moment blurred under the surge of adrenaline. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, waiting for her to speak her name. But the power of her captor's psychological hold remained absolute in those first moments. In her mind, their threats echoed louder than the questions raining down from strangers and police alike. Even as officers separated her from Mitchell and Barzee, Elizabeth was gripped by a paralyzing, disabling fear. Time slowed. A police officer knelt in front of her, his voice soft amid the chaos, asking, "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" The simple question created an explosion of doubt and hope in her mind. Could she answer? What if it wasn't safe? For nearly a minute, her tongue locked inside her mouth, a silent struggle between survival instincts and the possibility of freedom. She hesitated, body taut and silent, until finally, almost in a whisper, she nodded. "Yes, I'm Elizabeth." It was the first step toward breaking her mental chains. The subsequent car ride to the police station felt surreal. Officers shielded her from the media as best they could, speaking in gentle tones, ensuring she had food and water, basic comforts that now seemed otherworldly. Even then, Elizabeth's heart hammered, half convinced that her captors might find some way to wrench her back, that her entire rescue might dissolve in an instant. The edges between fantasy, nightmare, and reality blurred, a phenomenon familiar to many survivors of trauma. If physical rescue had its triumph and relief, the psychological escape would be a longer, more complex journey. In those critical stages after her return, Elizabeth's mind cycled through waves of disbelief and shock. Every interaction felt heightened, her body hyper-alert to stimuli, the sound of her name, the cool air on her skin, the unfamiliar comfort of safe hands guiding her through official offices and waiting rooms. She felt detached, as if hovering just outside her body, flooded with conflicting emotions, joy, fear, numbness, confusion. The reunion with her family triggered floods of feeling at once overwhelming and cleansing. Running into her parents' arms, Elizabeth wept, her tears holding the grief, exhaustion, and hope, hoarded over hundreds of nights in captivity. For her parents, holding their daughter again was the apex of 9 months of agony and endurance. But for Elizabeth, it was also the beginning of a different kind of battle. She was free, but the boundaries of her world had shifted irreparably. Home, once a place of perfect safety, now hummed with unfamiliar noise and the hovering attention of loved ones, police, and the media outside their window. Beyond the immediate relief, the weight of trauma made itself felt in dozens of subtle and overt ways. Night after night, Elizabeth struggled to sleep. A car passing outside, a creak in the hallway, or a dog barking could flood her with dread, her body responding to threats that were no longer there but imprinted deep in her nervous system. Sometimes she would find herself shrinking from touch, even from those she loved, as if her mind and body needed time to unlearn habits of submission. Social situations, so routine before, were now fraught with anxiety. Sometimes Elizabeth stared at her own reflection, half recognizing the teenager who'd been stolen, and the changed young woman returned. Simple choices, what to eat, when to speak, what to wear, became the proving ground for newfound autonomy. For so long, every move she made had been dictated by the whims of her captors. Recovery called for her to rediscover what it meant to trust her own judgment. Step by step, Elizabeth reclaimed the small freedoms of daily life. She chose her own food, determined when and whether to speak, and let herself rediscover the joys of music and hobbies that once brought her comfort. But detaching from the patterns of obedience and silence wasn't quick or easy. There were setbacks, moments when the urge to placate and withdraw flared up in the face of stress or uncertainty. Elizabeth's return was met with intense public attention. While many celebrated her survival as a miracle, crowds and news vans outside her home reminded her family of the hovering presence of danger and curiosity. Reporters jostled for interviews, headlines transformed her name into nationwide shorthand for survival, and strangers sent cards and letters by the hundreds. For Elizabeth, this onslaught was double-edged. Support from a community that had never given up was both reassuring and overwhelming. At times she longed to simply vanish into anonymity, while at others she recognized the power her story could have for others who felt trapped or hopeless. Therapy soon became a lifeline. Early sessions were raw and confusing. She unspooled memories she'd tried to bury, emotions she'd numbed for so long. Over time, counseling provided a language for her experience, giving her space to grieve, to rage, to ask questions that had once felt unspeakable. With slow persistence, Elizabeth learned to challenge the internalized voices of her captors, replacing them with her own words and the support of those who believed in her. The process of breaking free from the prison of her mind was non-linear. Sometimes progress was measured in ordinary miracles, laughing with siblings, returning to school, daring to speak her mind on a small issue at home. Other times, setbacks arose suddenly, an anniversary, a sound, or a scent triggering floods of memory and panic. Each victory, no matter how small, became both a symbol of healing and a reminder of how much had been stolen by trauma. I survived, Elizabeth would later reflect to herself, not just the forest and the violence, but the echo of that darkness inside me. With the passage of time, Elizabeth transformed survival into purpose. She began sharing her story publicly, speaking to schools and, eventually, on stages around the world. She refused to let her identity be defined solely by her captivity. The wounds and scars of those months remained, but they lived alongside fierce joy and a growing sense of agency. Each time Elizabeth reached another victim of abuse or spoke to those struggling to reclaim their lives, the forfeiture of her own silence became an act of rebellion, a continual breaking of the last, deepest lock her captors had installed, the belief that she would always be powerless. Throughout it all, Elizabeth found hope in the mundane. She played the harp, cooked with her family, went on long walks, and gave herself time to mourn what was lost and nurture what was still left to grow. Her faith in herself, in goodness, and in the possibility of joy gradually filled the places where fear had lived for so long. What had once been a seemingly inescapable inner prison gave way over time to a life defined not by captivity but by freedom, resilience, and connection. Elizabeth Smart's eventual return to herself is not only a testament to courage, it's a blueprint for what it means to break free from the prison of the mind. Her story reminds us all that rescue is not a single moment, but a journey, one that continues with every day we choose hope, healing, and the belief that no matter how dark the night, dawn can break anew. Life after the nightmare. Emerging from an ordeal as harrowing as 9 months in captivity, Elizabeth Smart's return to the world was not a neat storybook ending. The headlines called it a miracle. Her family celebrated, the world cheered, and journalists clamored for her words, but for Elizabeth, true freedom was a slow, jagged process fraught with invisible battles. The trauma didn't vanish with her captor's arrest. Instead, it lingered in patterns she had to unlearn, in the dark corners of memory, and in the simple, quiet moments of daily life that had once felt safe. Re-entry began with a barrage of love so fierce it almost hurt. Her family wrapped her in a protective cocoon, never wanting to let her out of sight again. Yet homecoming brought new fears. How would she fit into a family and community that had existed, frayed but still moving without her for so long? The world she left had changed, as had she. The Smart family itself now moved differently, older siblings more guarded, her parents watchful, her younger siblings torn between relief and the fear that safety could never be promised again. Elizabeth faced all the paradoxes that accompany survival. Outwardly, people marveled at her poise and composure, but inside, she wrestled with feelings of guilt, confusion, and a persistent, irrational sense of responsibility for having survived when so many don't. Everyday things, sitting at the dinner table, hearing laughter, walking to school, could suddenly trigger dizzying flashbacks. The taste of certain foods, the sound of branches scraping at a window, even the scent of rain on dirt could send her heart racing. Reclaiming her agency and sense of self was a monumental undertaking. Family therapists and a supportive community worked together to create a safe place for Elizabeth's healing, but the real work was deeply internal. She battled intrusive thoughts and nightmares, sometimes waking in a panic, unsure if rescue had been real or only a fleeting dream. Trust, once natural, now required effort. She looked at the faces around her and questioned deep down whom she could actually believe in. The betrayal of being taken by a familiar face haunted her, making social interactions fraught and uncertain. Elizabeth's family, meanwhile, faced their own separate challenges. Her parents struggled to adjust to her needs without treating her as too fragile. They wanted to shield her from pain but understood that overprotection could stunt her autonomy. Elizabeth's siblings tiptoed around her, unsure how to fill the gaps left by trauma. At times, the weight of expectations, both internal and external, grew overwhelming. She felt pressure to embody hope, to speak for other survivors, and to be okay for the sake of her family. School was both a refuge and a crucible. Returning classmates greeted her with a blend of awe, pity, and curiosity. Some asked well-meaning but invasive questions, others avoided her altogether, unsure of how to act. Teachers offered allowances and special treatment which Elizabeth sometimes resented, craving a sense of normalcy and equal footing. Every whispered conversation in the hallway, every abrupt silence when she entered a room, was a reminder of her ordeal's shadow. What Elizabeth learned early was that healing was not a straight line, but 1,000 small choices: to trust, to connect, to forgive, to fight for meaning. Therapy sessions became a space for her to untangle the horror she had lived through. She learned about trauma, how it lingers in the nervous system, how triggers might surprise her for years to come, and how to use breathing, grounding, and self-affirmation to fight back against the storms inside her mind. The process was often exhausting, with progress measured in fleeting moments of relief rather than in grand leaps. The media continued its relentless attention, sometimes ignoring boundaries in the pursuit of a compelling story. Reporters camped outside her family's home. Strangers sent letters, some full of empathy, some invasive or obsessed. With the help of her parents, Elizabeth set clear boundaries. She learned how to say no, to claim her story, and to choose when and how to share it. This too was a kind of reclaiming, a declaration that her value lay not in her trauma, but in her agency. In time, Elizabeth made the conscious decision to transform her pain into purpose. Speaking first to small groups and then nationally, she told her story not for sensationalism, but to advocate for other missing children, for survivors of abuse and exploitation, and for the importance of hope in the darkest times. Her words carried weight not only because of what she had endured, but because she refused to let it define her. Her advocacy was not always easy. Speaking publicly about trauma meant reliving parts of it, risking fresh wounds in pursuit of healing for herself and others. Yet Elizabeth found that in sharing, she helped shatter the silence that keeps reality at bay for countless victims. She spoke about resilience, faith, and forgiveness, not as abstract ideas but as hard-won truths. She inspired changes in law enforcement protocols, campaigned for the Amber Alert system, and worked to educate families and children on strategies for safety and recovery. Elizabeth built a life layered with joy and purpose, not in denial of her past, but with determined acknowledgement of its lessons. She married, became a mother, and focused on building a childhood for her own children filled with safety, open communication, and unconditional love, a strong contrast to the darkness she had survived. Her relationships, once strained by mistrust, deepened with honesty and time. Friends and family witnessed her transformation not as a return to who she was, but as the journey of becoming someone new, forged by adversity, yet still capable of joy. Still, to pretend that the trauma ever vanished completely would be disingenuous. There were anniversaries, nights of insomnia. There were sudden tears in the midst of ordinary afternoons. But these moments came to occupy less space than they once did. Elizabeth learned to forgive herself for the choices she made in captivity, and for the moments of paralysis or silence that had haunted her in the aftermath. She worked to dislodge the sense of responsibility that so many survivors carry, the relentless unfair question of, why me, and why did I survive when others don't? Through her work, Elizabeth connected more deeply with other survivors. They shared stories, strategies, and setbacks. Together, they debunked old myths, that healing requires forgetting, or that strength means showing no vulnerability. She became a living, breathing counterpoint to despair, a testament not just to survival, but to possibility. The Smart family, too, rebuilt. Theirs was a new normal marked by honesty and frank discussion about fear, boundaries, and hope. They honored Elizabeth's experience and trusted her to set the rhythm for her own recovery. Milestones, birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, were celebrated not just as triumphs of survival, but of family unity and the resilience of love. Prayer, music, laughter, and sometimes the simple act of sitting together in silence became the building blocks of a home restored. Elizabeth's story, in the end, cannot be reduced to headlines or speeches. It is lived every day in every hard conversation, every act of faith, and every quiet moment of hard-won peace. Her legacy is not just the tragedy she endured, but the hope and courage she handed back to the world, a torch for others in darkness. Today, Elizabeth lives as a mother, advocate, and survivor, showing that even after the most unimaginable nightmare, life, messy, precious, and real, can begin again.